Wake up out of your sleep.
An ABC7 article reveals that Pope Leo XIV, born Robert Francis Prevost in Chicago, has black ancestry through his maternal lineage rooted in New Orleans. This is coming from ABC News Channel 7 Los Angeles, but it's confirmed by Associated Press and The Guardian, who each report the same findings. Robert Francis Prevost, the Chicago-born man who became Pope Leo XIV on Thursday, has black family roots in New Orleans, Louisiana, records show. This is the article. It says ABC News has obtained several records, including U.S. Census records from the early 1900s, demonstrating that the first American Pope's family tree reflects the complex racial history of this country. The census records themselves are from the 1900s, so we're looking backward from those records at people who were in the 1800s then, right? Both of Leo XIV's maternal grandparents, Joseph Martinez and Louis Baquier, are described as black or mulatto in several census documents. Syntactically, this sentence that I just read should be saying, if it was written correctly, that both Joseph Martinez and Louis Baquier each have census records where they are referred to as black, and then they each have census records where they are referred to as mulatto. All right, so continuing, on their 1887 marriage license, Martinez listed his birthplace as Haiti, and birth records show that he was born in Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic. Chris Smothers, professional genealogist for 15 years and historian studying at Simmons University, told ABC News that these were the same territories at the time, meaning that at that time, as of the mid 1800s, Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic was still already Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic. We haven't gone back far enough for it to be some other territory, is all they're saying there. Bacquier's birth records, continuing, Bacquier's birth records show she was born in New Orleans. Despite Martinez being born abroad, his father, the Pope's great-grandfather, was found to be from Louisiana, Smothers said, emphasizing the Pope's ancestry in the American South. They got a professional genealogist to do all of this, and the professional genealogist is saying that even though Grandpa Martinez was born in Haiti, his father was born in Louisiana. So we're back to Louisiana even just one generation prior, which is why Louisiana is where we're going to look to figure out some more information about who he is, who he comes from. Look at this next line. Quote, "It's clear that the Pope has centuries-long ties to free people of color in Louisiana," end quote, Smothers told ABC News. Okay, so the reason this is significant, of course, is because free persons of color in North America are typically given that term, free person of color, because they were indigenous. They may have had enslaved ancestors, but they were indigenous and they were not enslaved. To be a free person of color, think about this logically here. If you come from Africa, you were brought as a slave. You are unlikely to be a free person of color. You are most likely going to be enslaved. You see what I'm saying? You see what I'm saying? So you are a person of color, just like the African slave, whose advent to North America we're not denying. But what we're saying is, if you're a free person of color, it is overwhelmingly more likely that you would be indigenous. This is a book called Indian Slavery in Colonial Times Within the Present Limits of the United States. It's written by a renowned author, Alman Wheeler Lauber. I've actually quoted other texts from this same author in previous presentations. But I want you to look at page 64 of this book, bottom paragraph, starting from the bottom paragraph. On July 23rd, 1745, we're in the 1700s. Remember, the genealogist traced the Pope's ancestry back to into the deep 1800s. On July 23rd, 1745, the Royal Council at Paris sanctioned the possession of Indian slaves by declaring that all slaves who might follow the enemy to the colonies of France and their effects should belong to His Most Christian Majesty. After the acquisition of Canada, the Parliament of Great Britain showed itself favorable to the importation of slaves into the colonies. Accordingly, the 47th article of the capitulation of September 8th, 1760 provided, quote, "The Negroes and Pawnees of both sexes shall remain in their quality of slaves, in the possession of French and Canadians to whom they belong. They shall be at liberty to keep them in their service in the colony or to sell them, and they shall also continue to bring them up in the Roman religion." End quote. So in other texts from other authors at times, including the text of Jack D. Forbes, we have learned that Negro was a term that, at least on the Spanish side and the Portuguese side, was constantly being used to describe the Indians themselves. But the French were not using the word Negro to describe the Indians. They were making a separation between the two, between the Indian slaves and the African slaves, and Negro was only being used to refer to the African slaves. However, let's keep reading. Much of the French exploration was carried on by the missionaries. So this is really the church leading all the exploration of the American interior. Slaveholding was not inconsistent with the belief of these religious travelers. Two objects inspired their zeal: the greater glory of God and the influence and credit of the Order of Jesus. Remember, the Order of Jesus, that's the Jesuits, of which many of them, continuing on to page 66, of which many of them were members. So these missionaries who are leading the exploration and encouraging the holding of slaves, and even holding slaves themselves, were Jesuits themselves. They were Jesuit missionaries. These are French Jesuit missionaries in the French colony of Louisiana, and they're holding slaves. Now, this what I just read carried us from page 65 over to page 66, but then I want you to look at, if we go back to page 65 for a second, I want you to look at the citation at the citations at the bottom. The middle one gives you some information on how the word Pawnee is being used. It says, though the word Pawnee in the records seems to have special reference to Indian slaves, it is sometimes used by the old Canadian writers to signify all persons in servitude. All persons in servitude. All the slaves, including the ones who were thought to be from Africa, were commonly referred to as Pawnee, which means there's actually not a lot of care being taken right now to keep that separation intact. They're trying to keep some people from from this French territory are trying to keep that separation intact, but the Canadian writers, the ones from up north, they didn't see it as necessary to do that, so they would call them all Pawnee. And it's likely because, coming from Canada, they were not actually as in tune with the slaves of the colony coming down to Louisiana to see these people. And so they really genuinely could not tell the difference, because they weren't there when these slaves were initially separated into their respective categories. Now I want to read further here on page 66 and page 67 to follow, because there's another key point to make here. But I'm going to skip this top paragraph on page 66 and come down to the next paragraph, which says, "The records do not show any great numbers of slaves owned by the missionary explorers." Let's stop right there for a second. It does give a reason as to why, but the reason actually doesn't matter as much as the fact that the records don't show great numbers of slaves owned by the missionary explorers. But here's the thing. The fact that they didn't have great numbers of slaves, but did have lots of people of color, is a significant nugget. Why? Because if you are brought from Africa, or if you are brought from the Caribbean in this situation, into Louisiana, into New Orleans specifically, you were a slave. You had to be enslaved to get brought on a slave ship. Does that make sense? In order for you to get put on a slave ship, you would have to be a slave. You would have to be enslaved first, and then be brought to the mainland as a slave. That hopefully that makes sense. So my point is, if you got a bunch of persons of color who are not enslaved, then that's because they are indigenous. They would not be Africans who were brought to the missionaries and then freed. That's not what would be happening. That wouldn't make any sense, because voyages bringing slaves to the Americas or to the mainland, or transporting slaves by slave ship from any point A to any point B, those voyages always had to be financed by someone, and whoever financed them was doing so in order to get work out of them, to get a sale out of them to someone who obviously would not spend that kind of money unless they had need for servitude. And so you're not gonna find Africans being brought somewhere and they're free. That's not what's happening. Free persons of color are going to be Indians, period. So I wanted to read that, and I'm gonna skip down to page 67 just to catch one more thing. We're gonna read the bottom paragraph of page 67. So check this out. It says, "The chief, though not the earliest source of Indian slaves," so it says the chief, so it's saying the chief source of Indian slaves, but not the earliest source of Indian slaves among the French, was that of captives taken in war with the Indian tribes. So this is another thing buttressing what I was saying before, which is that the majority of the slaves anyway were actually Indian slaves anyway, the Indian tribes.
Hey y'all! First of all, like and subscribe to the channel, but also, Unahia is recruiting, and if you don't know what Unahia is, we're a grassroots activist group lobbying Congress to amend a bill to require education and research to acknowledge the Negro origins of Aboriginal groups of North America. If any of you have it to give, please support the campaign using the QR code on your screen, join the campaign with a donation, and if you have the time, you can even join our staff to help guide the organization, not just for this campaign, but also future endeavors. Don't speak about it, be about it. Let's go.
Wars with Indian tribes was the primary source from which all of these slaves were even coming in the first place. Now remember, they're saying Pawnee for all the indigenous people of this colony a lot of the time. We covered that. The Canadians are just coming in and calling everybody Pawnee. the French Canadian, that's because they have no regard for all the different tribes of Indians that there were, right? And the Pawnee are not actually from Louisiana originally. They were brought to Louisiana, right? This land that they were brought to is not theirs. They're from, and I actually covered this very, very briefly in a recent presentation on half-breed tracks when I was talking about the history of reservations. They're from Nebraska. They're from Nebraska. The reason why that's significant, of course, is Nebraska is one of the earliest places where reservations first started being made for Indians, land reserves, which were called half-breed tracts. Why? Because the people who got put on reservations in the first place were not full-blood Indians. They were half-breeds, and when they said half-breed, they didn't even mean exactly half. They just meant mixed at all. And so, but anyway, this is not Pawnee territory here in French Louisiana. And so you've got to understand that that even though these are Indians, there are other tribes represented among the Pawnee here. And many of the Indians being called Pawnee are not Pawnee, and not all of the Indians, all of the other tribes that you'll see mentioned, especially the one you're about to see mentioned, are necessarily from Louisiana. So we continue reading here. It says, for many years after the coming of the French to Louisiana, they and the Natchez Indians lived in friendly intercourse. Minor Indian troubles in 1711 and 1715 resulted in the enslavement and transportation of certain Indians to Cape Francois on the island of Haiti. The hostilities begun with the Natchez Indians in 1715 continued intermittently until 1740. In 1730, because of ill treatment by Monsieur du Chappart, governor of Fort Rosalie, who wished the site of a Natchez village on which to build a town, and because of other abuses, the Natchez rose against the French and massacred over 200 of them. Natchez fought back and were slaughtering these white people. But you notice that there was enslavement and transportation of these Natchez Indians to Haiti during this years-long conflict, decades-long conflict. And that's pretty critical because remember, the Taino were getting moved around, and in the Caribbean, when you're trying to trace Indian roots, you're actually playing a game of cups. And some of it's typically assumed that they were just replaced with Africans. But in fact, you commonly investigate and find that on many of these islands, they were not just replaced with Africans, they were oftentimes replaced with Indians. Indians were being replaced with more Indians. And that happened pretty often. And so Haiti here is the example we're looking at, where Taino Indians were getting moved off the island, but they of course were being replaced by a slave workforce from elsewhere. And we see a good number of them were actually Natchez Indians from Louisiana. The original Natchez territory was southern Mississippi, by the way. So continuing on page 68 with this same thing, Governor Perrier formed an army and advanced against them in their fort. The Natchez offered to leave the place if their lives were spared. Their offer was accepted, but they were detained as prisoners, all but 20, who escaped. About 450 of the tribe, including the Great Son, the Little Son, and several of the principal war chiefs, were captured and carried to New Orleans. Remember, New Orleans is a port town that for bringing in boats and sending boats off, right? The women and children were retained as slaves on the plantations. Some of the prisoners were burned in New Orleans. The great son, the little son, their families, and more than 400 of the captives were sent at once to Cape Francois, Haiti, and most of them sold to the planters as slaves. So the slaves in Haiti would have to include a bunch of Natchez Indians. And not just Natchez Indians, many of them were actually chiefs. Many of them were war chiefs in particular, which explains why, which explains to some extent, perhaps, why Haiti has a reputation for the most successful rebellion against colonization, right? And we'll look more at that in future presentations, but that is actually the history of the connection of Haiti and Louisiana in antebellum American history. And when we take these things into account and remember that these things were happening in the 1700s, these things were happening in the 1700s, we have to then remember that for the new pope to be coming from free people of color in Louisiana, it is almost certain that the free people of color from whom he descends were indigenous people. They were Pawnee or Natchez Indians, who made up the bulk of the slave workforce in Louisiana at the time, and especially in and around New Orleans. So this would be someone whom, again, Jack D. Forbes and the Portuguese and the Spanish would have all referred to as Negro, which also explains why his ancestors, because the thing is, these classifications, they evolved over time, and when you get to the 1800s, mulatto in the 1800s really means Indian if the English are saying it. If the Spanish are saying it, they genuinely mean mulatto, and what they mean by that is mixed. But the English did not have much regard for the word mulatto. Jack D. Forbes himself even says that mulatto oftentimes just meant Indian when the English used it, when the English used that word. Sometimes Pope Leo's grandparents were called mulatto, and then other times those same grandparents in different decades were just called black. And that is because and for any of you who have done your genealogy, if you're black and you're looking and you've done your genealogy and you're looking for evidence that you may have been indigenous, you need to trace that word mulatto. Whenever they were calling you mulatto, the English would only call you mulatto if they meant Indian, particularly in the 1800s. In the 1800s, that's how they were using the word. So anyway, I point that out to demonstrate that Pope Leo, they're saying he has black ancestry, which is in and of itself interesting. But this black ancestry is actually most likely indigenous, perhaps entirely indigenous. And the other point to put out there is that we're talking about as much as half of his ancestry. We're talking both of his maternal both of his maternal grandparents, right? Well, you only have 4 grandparents. 2 out of 4 were listed as black on census record, and those same 2 were also listed as mulatto on other census records. So these were Indians, dark-skinned Indians, right? That's what these people were. They were dark-skinned Indians, and that accounts for 2 out of 4 of his grandparents. What this does mean is that someone with American Indian blood is now Pope. So when they say this is the first American Pope, truly, this is us coming full circle, because the papacy is really the ones who sent those Jesuits to even enslave these people. And over the course of time, those people have sent someone back to take over the Vatican, which is actually kind of poetic justice. And ironically also, the news is reporting now that his taking of the name Pope Leo is indicative of his commitment to social justice. Pope Leo is a name that is associated with social justice because of the popes who have had that name before him, and the things that they did. And so they believe that he's actually signaling to other knowledgeable Catholics that he intends to focus on social justice, and that he's signaling that by choosing this name. What I truly think is significant about this is the fact that Pope Leo is actually opposing Donald Trump and his administration on a number of things, coming out against certain statements that have been made by J.D. Vance, the vice president, and stuff like that. And there has been some news coverage of that. But what it signifies to me is that there isn't the Illuminati as we think of it. A lot of you think of this united cabal of power wielders controlling the world, and you think that this is all theater, but you don't seem to consider the possibility that actually the people who are running things around the world are actually divided against themselves, and that it's not theater, that their conflict is real. They make sweeping changes in the world because they are constantly trying to usurp each other's power. And this is a pope who is at odds with the president of the United States. And this pope is an American Indian. Well, you know, not really, but he is a person who does carry American Indian blood to some unverifiable extent. and this is key because, of course, the Catholic Church is the purveyor of historic subterfuge, duplicity, oppression, slavery for the American Indian, who is in fact believed by many, and certainly was believed by many at the time during the institution of slavery, to be the descendants of ancient Israel. And so were those slaves brought from Africa, who are now united, all the tribes united here in North America. And from North America comes this guy, a mutt of several different groups, both colonizer and colonized. And yet he is apparently perhaps on the side of those colonizers who do genuinely feel white guilt and empathize with our plight. And this may signify a turn of sorts that is coming, and it may be the Vatican trying to get ahead of the power shift that they know is coming. They know this power shift is coming. They can't do anything to stop it, and if they could, they would. But they know that they're not going to win, and there's another side against them who's saying, no, we can beat this. And there's this, and then you have this side that's saying, no, we're not going to be able to beat this. The Catholic Church knows all too well that it's not beatable. They have seen the power of prophecy. They have seen what we have done. They have seen what our ancestors have accomplished, and they know that that power is not actually insurmountable. So they know that they're not going to be able to defeat it. That's perhaps why they're trying to position themselves to seem as though they've been on our side for a long time and that they're in support of us. It is a tactic of self-preservation, a tactic to preserve themselves when that power shift comes.
Perfect.